And welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Eun-jung Cho. North Korean leader Kim Jong-un threatened to use nuclear weapons to destroy South Korea forever if provoked. Amid deteriorating security conditions, Japan's new prime minister proposed an Asian NATO. Today, we discuss whether this is a viable plan.
集団安全保障の本質は義務でございます。
전체 조선인민이 피어린 투쟁으로 이룩한 우리 국위를 놓고 그 누가도 흥정하지 않을 것입니다.
우리 군과 한미 동맹의 결연하고 압도적인 대응에 직면하게 될 것입니다. 그날이 바로 북한 정권 종말의 날이 될 것입니다.
In the studio with me, Mr. Dennis Wilder, professor at Georgetown University. Mr. Wilder was senior director for East Asian Affairs at the National Security Council during the George W. Bush administration. Mr. Wilder was CIA's deputy assistant director for East Asia and the Pacific. Also joining us, Mr. Mark Fitzpatrick, Associate Fellow and former Executive Director at the International Institute for Strategic Studies Americas. Mr. Fitzpatrick was Acting Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Non-Proliferation. His diplomatic postings included Vienna, Seoul, Tokyo, and Wellington. Welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Now, Professor Wilder, Japan's new Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba has proposed creating an Asian version of NATO, and this was his repeated campaign pledge, and he also reiterated during his first news conference as the elected leader of the Liberal Democratic Party. And Japan's foreign minister also said this is a plan for the future, suggesting it wasn't just a one-off comment from the Prime Minister. How viable is this plan?
You know, I'm a little perplexed by the fact that he has made such an emphasis on this, because one of his themes is that somehow a NATO in Asia would lock America into the defense of Japan more closely. Well, I think we're pretty locked in. I think that having over 50,000 troops in Japan, our new plans with the Japanese government, our work with the Japanese and Korean governments, I don't see where Japan feels we need to lock in further. So I am not sure what this brings that we don't already have today.
And Mr. Fitzpatrick, what are some of Japan's domestic obstacles to building an Asian NATO? How far can Japan go in collective defense? And Ishiba also suggested using Asian NATO as platform for bringing in U.S. nuclear weapons. Isn't that against Japan's 3 non-nuclear principles?
Yes, there are so many obstacles to these suggestions. He's really a forward thinker, to say it positively. I agree, he's unrealistic. Right. But let's start with the laws and the political climate that make it so hard for Japan to engage in collective defense. The Constitution, Article 9, famously prohibits the use of force. Now, that prohibition has been reinterpreted over the years to allow for the creation of the self-defense forces, but it never has been changed to allow Japan to have collective defense with the United States or other countries. Then, the idea of joint control of U.S. Nuclear weapons, that would violate not the Constitution, but the 3 non-nuclear principles enunciated by the late Prime Minister Eisaku Sato in 1967. It's what got him the Nobel Peace Prize, by the way. And these three non-nuclear principles, no manufacture, no possession, no introduction of nuclear weapons, that third one, it's actually already been violated many times. The United States and Japan had a secret coda to their treaty that allowed U.S. warships to bring in nuclear weapons. And in 2010, a leftist Japanese government actually tried to change the three non-nuclear principles, make them 2.5 nuclear principles to allow such an introduction. But they didn't have political support across the spectrum. I think someday Japan will change to 2.5 to allow for such nuclear sharing, but not today.
If any of you can take my question, you said Ishiba is idealistic, but do you think his ideas are just personal ideas? Wouldn't that be a long-term strategic collective thinking? Shinzo Abe came up with the Indo-Pacific phrase, and that strategic thinking actually led to Quad.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's too early to tell whether the whole Japanese elite in the LDP and elsewhere are for this. Now, I did notice that today, in his first policy address, he did not mention this idea. So there seems to be just a little backing away at this point, even on his part. There may be some criticism from Washington that he's heard. He may realize that this is a bridge too far for Washington. So let's see.
So if I could jump in here, you asked, is he just an individualist thinking about this? But I would say that these ideas are ideas that have been percolating in Japan for a while. I mean, my friends I used to work with when I was a U.S. diplomat in Japan, they're commenting on the media all the time. They're talking about nuclear sharing, and they're saying, well, we're not saying we demand it now, but let's at least talk about it. And so the fact that Prime Minister Ishiba is putting this out there and then he's having to walk it back a little bit, it's being talked about in Japan, and it's not just him.
Mm-hmm. And Professor Wilder, you just mentioned about reservations on the U.S. side about the Asian NATO and the nuclear sharing idea. Also, Assistant Secretary of State Daniel Crittenbrick also said that it is too early to discuss Asian NATO. What do you think U.S. reaction would be?
Well, first of all, I think that the new Prime Minister needs to get a briefing on exactly what we're doing these days, because we are changing 70 years of history in terms of the operational relationship with the Japanese military. We have announced a new Joint Operations Command in Japan. Frankly, U.S. Forces Japan always was an administrative headquarters, not a combat headquarters like U.S. Forces Korea. We are now saying we will have a true combat headquarters in Japan, and at the same time, the Japanese Self-Defense Force is creating a Joint Operations Command of its own, which will work hand in glove with the new American command. This is very important, because what it does is it takes warfighting in Japan to a new level of exercises, training, operational planning. And this changes the situation where Indo-Pacific Command, which is an 8-hour flight away from Tokyo, no longer is the seat of planning for operations. So I think he needs to understand that we're making very real changes. We also have the Marine littoral units moving to Japanese islands. We have the new INF violating, if you will, although the INF is old and gone, missiles that we're going to put out in the area. So I think he needs a briefing. I think he needs to understand this.
And Professor Wilder, you're the top China expert in America. And
I don't think I accept that title, but okay.
One of the reasons Ishiba wants Asian NATO is to check against North Korea and China's nuclear threat. And wouldn't Asian NATO actually be helpful to America in checking against China?
No, because Asian NATO would be a very complicated structure with very different cultures, unlike Europe, very different perspectives by our allies in East Asia. It's one of the reasons why we've had a hub and spoke situation in East Asia. Trying to coordinate a NATO of Asia would be very, very difficult. Where would it be located? Which capital are we going to put an Asian NATO in? I'm sure the Japanese would want it in Tokyo. But there are a lot of complexity.
The Asian countries have different approach to China. And
Yeah,
would
absolutely.
they all align together to go against China, especially countries like India or those countries in Southeast Asia? Would they come to defend each other if they get in a military conflict with China?
I think you raise an excellent question. We already see in the Quad that India is very reluctant on the security side to get much deeper. They're happy in the Quad with some of the humanitarian efforts on such things as pandemics, but they keep their distance. And so the idea that India can be drawn into an Asian NATO, I think, is pretty far-fetched.
Mm-hmm. And do you think, Professor Wilder, Chinese President Xi Jinping, in congratulating Ishiba, said he hopes Japan will abide by the 4 political documents, including the One China policy. Is China wary of Ishiba's direction of security policy, including Asian NATO?
I'm absolutely sure they are. A lot of what the LDP and Ishiba now has been doing really upsets Beijing. The new closeness between Korea, Japan, and the United States in defense planning has very much caught them off guard and upset them. The American plans to put forces in Luzon at new bases there with new missile systems. You can see the tensions now between the Philippines and China, and the Chinese accusing the Philippines of simply being a cat's paw for the United States. AUKUS, the Quad. All of these things the Chinese say are bloc activities. They escalate tensions. They create arms escalation in the region. So yes, from Beijing's point of view, this is very worrisome. From our point of view, it's very helpful to keep China on its back foot and deterred from thinking about taking Taiwan.
And Mr. Fitzpatrick, Ishiba's first phone call was with President Biden and then with President Yoon Suk-yeol of South Korea. Do you think Prime Minister Ishiba will take the currently very good Korea-Japan relations to the next level?
Well, I hope he will, and I think he's off to a very good start. As you say, his second phone call to his closest neighbor, and relations have improved so much over the last few years. But I'm not confident that he will take it to the next level. What I think he will do is keep it at least at the level it's at. I think one of the reasons that former Prime Minister Kishida backed Ishiba is because they have a shared vision of the importance of relations with Republic of Korea. But if I could say one other thing about this, it's not as important of who Kishida's successor, Ishiba, is. What's more important is who will be the successor to the current South Korean president, Yoon Suk-yeol, because he was the one who gets the thanks. He was the one who was responsible for improving these relations. He took the very difficult step to compromise, to not force Japan to pay reparations for the forced labor. I mean, he made a real, politically courageous move. And the question will be, will his successor keep it at the same level or move it up, especially if his successor is from a progressive party that has traditionally more jaundiced views toward Japan?
Do you think American officials are also wary of the possibility that the bilateral relations could plummet at any time? Are they making any backup plans for that?
I think American officials have, for so long been wanting Japan and South Korea to come closer together. And they've been so happy to see the developments. And I'm sure that they, in all of their, discussions, are encouraging this. I'm not sure what backup plans they would have. The backup plans are probably, the bilateral relationships we have, but which we always wish was more of a triangular relationship.
If I could add, I think what U.S. officials will be doing, because it would be what I would be doing at the NSC, is institutionalizing this as much as possible to make it difficult to back away from some of this. So what you try and do is you put a lot on paper. You create the institutions to back it up, the conferences, the dialogues, the annual meetings, and you try to lock in the next government. May not work, but it's a way.
We see a lot of that going on these days. Professor Wilder, Kim Jong-un threatened to use nuclear weapons to destroy South Korea, emphasizing that North Korea is already a nuclear state. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said that denuclearizing North Korea is a closed issue. Director General of IAEA, Rafael Grossi, said North Korea has become a de facto nuclear weapon state. Does IAEA lend credibility to North Korea and Russia's claims? And given that IAEA is the lead agency to safeguard the non-proliferation regime, wouldn't Grossi's comments undermine denuclearization efforts?
You know, on these topics, I defer to Professor Gallucci at Georgetown, who's a real expert. And what he says, and what I believe, is arms control is fading badly. We have the SALT treaties gone, we have the INF treaty gone, we have the ABM treaty gone. There was a high point where we were really moving ahead with arms control, with non-proliferation. It's a sad fact, but for whatever reasons, of course, the Russians have backed away, the Chinese aren't interested. A lot of these third world countries aren't interested. So I think we have a problem.
Yes, why don't I add to the comment then? Dr. Mira Rapp-Hooper, Senior Director for Indo-Pacific Affairs, said in March the U.S. will consider interim steps on the pathway to denuclearization. Undersecretary Bonnie Jenkins said that she's open to arms control talks with North Korea. Recently, a Deputy Special Representative for North Korea, Seth Bailey, said that although U.S. is committed to denuclearization, the conversation doesn't have to start with denuclearization. Are these comments signs that U.S. is moving from denuclearization to arms control and risk reduction talks with North Korea?
I think these are pragmatic responses to the reality that we all see that North Korea has nuclear weapons. You know, for Director General Grossi at the IAEA to acknowledge the truth is just simple. You know, if not to acknowledge it would be something that you might look askance at him. Governments have to be careful what they say because they don't want to give the impression that in describing reality, they are accepting reality. And there's a big difference between those. You know, we don't accept that North Korea is nuclear armed. The United States will continue to demand denuclearization, but as a goal. And in the meantime, if you can't get to that goal in the near future, are these dedicated conscientious U.S. civil servants supposed to not do anything? No, they have to do what they can to reduce nuclear dangers. And I think I'm glad that they have been, saying we can try to move ahead in some area. Now, whether North Korea will be responsive, that's another matter. As for the Russian foreign minister's statements, I don't agree with that at all. But I don't think he was, necessarily wrong. To call North Korea nuclear armed.
Well, some experts point out that because Rafael Grossi is in a very public position as the Director General of IAEA, he does have weight as much as any government officials when it comes to any comments about denuclearization. And also, Robert O'Brien, the National Security Advisor for the Trump administration, said that regarding Grossi's comments, he said that why wouldn't Japan and South Korea and others not want to get their own nuclear weapons at that point if you recognize North Korea as a nuclear country and start treating it in arms control the way you would with Russia and China? It's a dicey question. So what he's saying is if people start arms control talks with North Korea, if IAEA and US government starts arms control talks with North Korea, that would be same as recognizing North Korea as a nuclear armed state, and that would open the doors for South Korea to get its own nuclear weapons.
Yeah, I know people have been saying that for a long time. I just don't buy that logic. Why recognizing reality is accepting them as nuclear armed, and then that would somehow give an impetus to other states to say, oh, we can do it too. There's so many other reasons why those states wouldn't go down that path. I don't think it adds to their incentives at all.
Because there's so much connotations and there's so much significance to whatever official negotiations you launch with any other country.
Well, launching negotiations is one thing.
But calling it arms control?
Grossi isn't launching any negotiations. The United States isn't launching any. They're suggesting that we could try to address nuclear threats and reduce nuclear risks. And if you want to call that arms control talks, if it results in lesser nuclear risk while still maintaining the denuclearization goal, to me, that's logical.
I think that the key calculation for South Korea and Japan is whether or not they believe in the extended deterrent from the United States. And that is the primary issue that we've heard from the Koreans. Certainly in the Trump era, they worried about that. So for these people, it's not a question of whether the North has weapons or not. They know the North has weapons. It's a question of the United States. Will the United States really come to defend us if we are under nuclear threat?
I so agree with that. That is the primary factor that would keep them non-nuclear or encourage them to go the other direction. And
critics in South Korea point out that United States has succeeded in stopping its ally from making a nuclear weapon and not succeeded in stopping North Korea from making nuclear weapon. How would you respond to that?
Well, that is a fact. That is a fact. In the 1970s, South Korea was pursuing nuclear weapons. The United States leaned heavily on them and kept them in the non-nuclear field. And South Korea has been a leader in non-proliferation ever since then. North Korea, we had little leverage. The one leverage that we possibly had but didn't use was attacking their nuclear facilities. We didn't do that primarily because our ally, South Korea, did not want us to. They did not want us to spark the Korean War and the threat to Seoul that would ensue. So if any South Koreans were to criticize the United States for letting North Korea go nuclear, I think the response is, yeah, we're sorry about that. It is really horrible, but would you have wanted us to attack them and go into a war again?
And if I may defend myself, I spent most of the Bush administration trying desperately to get agreements with the North Koreans through the six-party talks. We were committed, President Bush was committed, the Chinese were committed. I think had the elder Kim not suffered a stroke, we might be in a different place today. That's probably wishful thinking. But it's not for want of trying.
Thank you for trying. I did not want to suggest that you weren't trying. We did so much.
Now, Mr. Fitzpatrick, Secretary Blinken called Russia, China, North Korea, Iran revisionist powers that are challenging the international system. North Korea used to be a pariah, but now does it have more clout in international politics? And by supporting other revisionist powers, doesn't it have new enemies like Israel and Ukraine that could seriously hurt North Korea's own security?
I think North Korea is still a pariah. I think it's still a rogue state, the term we used to use. Calling it revisionist, that's more polite. And probably North Korea would like that term because they do want to revise the world order led by the United States. Do they get more power by banding together with Russia, China, Iran? I suppose so. When states band together, they all increase their power a little bit. But it's temporary, it's opportunistic, it's transactional. I don't think it's going to last all that long. And in the meantime, yeah, they do antagonize other states. Now, North Korea antagonized Israel long ago when they transferred missiles to Iran and to Iraq and other enemies of Israel. And Israel, attacked back via intelligence means. Ukraine doesn't have a means of payback to North Korea, but South Korea does.
Mm-hmm. And Professor Wilder, Deputy Secretary Kurt Campbell said China and Russia are competing for influence over North Korea, and China is anxious about some of the actions that Russia did with North Korea. Is this a good time to get China to act more proactively in reining in North Korea?
I can tell you in my recent discussions with the Chinese, they're very worried about this question. In fact, they are asking us what kind of intelligence we have on the issue. So in that sense, there is an opportunity here. The Chinese don't trust the North Koreans. They don't fully trust Putin. They don't know what Putin is transferring to the North Koreans. That makes them nervous. So I think in intelligence channels with the Chinese, we can work a bit together on this question. So I think there is opportunity here.
Well, on that positive note, we'll end our discussion here. Mr. Fitzpatrick, Professor Wilder, thank you so much for joining us.
This has been fun. Thank you.
And thank you for watching. We'll be back here next week with U.S. experts to discuss the two Koreas and the region right here from Washington.